The millionaire thought she was just a contract bride, until their wedding night revealed the truth. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. She stood outside the towering glass building, her worn-out sneakers soaked from the rain. In her trembling hands was a thin folder that contained everything she had left in this world, a desperate plea for a contract. Her family's small house was days away from foreclosure. Her younger brother's medical bills stacked higher than she could count, and she had no other choice. She had promised her mother, before she passed, that she would protect the family no matter what. And tonight, that promise had led her here to sign away her freedom in exchange for survival. Inside, he was waiting. The millionaire. Tall, commanding, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that looked as if it had been crafted for royalty. His gaze was cold, the kind of gaze that measured people as numbers, contracts, assets. To him, marriage was not love. It was a shield against his family's endless pressure, a tool to silence shareholders, a performance for the outside world. When she walked into his office, dripping rainwater onto the polished floor, she bowed slightly and forced a shaky smile. "I am here to sign." He did not smile back. He slid the document across the desk with a single deliberate motion. The papers smelled faintly of expensive ink and power. The contract was detailed, harsh, and painfully clear. No love, no intimacy. A marriage that existed only on paper for 1 year. In exchange, he would pay off her debts and cover her brother's treatments. "Read it carefully," he said in a voice smooth but distant. "I do not tolerate misunderstandings." Her eyes traced the cold words. No touch, no claim. Appearances only, a signature at the bottom, in exchange for money that would save her family. Her chest tightened. Her heart screamed to run. But the image of her brother's fragile smile, hooked up to machines at the hospital, forced her hand to move. With trembling fingers, she signed her name. He leaned back in his chair, watching her. For a brief moment, she wondered if there was even a flicker of humanity in his eyes. But the way he spoke next was sharp, cutting off that hope. "From this moment on, you are my wife in public, and a stranger in private. Do not forget the terms. If you break them, you will regret it." "No." Her lips parted, but no words came out. The weight of the contract pressed down like iron chains. She wanted to hate him. She wanted to scream at him for treating marriage like a business transaction. But she swallowed her pride, because pride could not pay hospital bills. He reached into a small velvet box and placed a ring on the table between them. It glittered coldly under the office lights, beautiful but heavy with meaning. "Wear it. The world will believe we are perfect." Her fingers hovered above the ring. It was too big, too perfect, too expensive for her calloused hand. She hesitated, then slipped it on. It fit as if it had been waiting for her all along, mocking her with its flawless shine. His phone buzzed. "The car is waiting," he said flatly. "Tomorrow we will make the announcement. You should prepare yourself. Cameras are ruthless." She nodded faintly. Inside, her heart cracked. Tomorrow the world would see her as the wife of a millionaire. But only she knew the truth, that she was nothing more than a contract bride, bound to a man who believed love was a weakness. And yet, in the silence that followed, a strange thought crept into her mind. Maybe one day, she would prove him wrong. The next morning, the city awoke to headlines that shimmered across every screen. Photographers had swarmed the steps of the courthouse, their flashes relentless, as she stood beside him with the heavy ring glittering on her trembling hand. To the public, they were perfection. He held her arm firmly, his posture protective, his gaze steady for the cameras. Yet when the final shutter closed and the crowd dispersed, his hand fell from hers like a stone slipping into water. The warmth vanished. Inside his penthouse, silence stretched. The place was immaculate, marble floors polished until they reflected her nervous steps. The air smelled faintly of cedar and cold leather, not a trace of home. "This is where you will stay," he said, gesturing toward a room at the far end of the corridor. His tone was clipped, like an instruction rather than an invitation. Do not enter my study. Do not touch anything that is not yours. We will appear together when necessary. Beyond that, live as you wish. Just remember the contract binds you to discretion. Her lips parted, but she pressed them shut. The words she wanted to say, that she was not a thief, not an intruder, died in her throat. Instead, she stepped into the room he had given her. The bed was vast, dressed in silk sheets, more luxurious than anything she had ever owned. But she felt smaller than ever, a guest in her own marriage. That evening, the staff prepared dinner in the grand dining hall. A long table stretched between them, polished silver gleaming under the chandelier. She reached for conversation, asking about his day, his work, his life. His answers were short, precise, almost mechanical. Meetings, contracts, deadlines. The gulf between them widened with every word left unsaid. Finally, she placed her fork down and whispered, "You do not need to treat me as if I am invisible. I am not your enemy." His gaze lifted, sharp and unyielding. "You are not my wife either. You are my contract." The words pierced her chest. She clenched her hands together under the table to keep from trembling. He rose, his chair scraping against the polished floor, and left without another word. Later that night, rain lashed against the tall windows. She wandered through the silent halls, her footsteps echoing. On a table in the living room, she noticed a photograph in a silver frame. It showed him as a child, standing between parents whose smiles looked rehearsed. A small detail caught her eye, the boy's hand clenched tightly at his side, as if bracing against something unseen. Her heart softened despite herself. Perhaps his coldness was not born of cruelty, but of wounds hidden deep. She returned to her room, lying awake as the storm raged outside, realizing that the clash between them was only beginning. For the world, they were the picture of a perfect marriage. Inside those walls, however, they were strangers locked in a battle of silence, each fighting for survival in different ways. She fought for her family's future. He fought to protect a heart he had long buried under wealth and duty. And neither of them knew yet that fate had already begun weaving threads that no contract could contain. The following weeks blurred into a routine that felt both suffocating and surreal. In public, they performed their roles flawlessly. He placed his arm around her at charity galas, guided her through glittering ballrooms, and allowed the cameras to capture a smile that never reached his eyes. She mirrored the part of the elegant bride, her thrift store grace hidden beneath gowns selected by his assistants. To the world, they were a power couple, polished and enviable. Yet behind closed doors, the walls of the penthouse echoed with silence and tension. They crossed paths in the hallway with little more than polite nods. At breakfast, he scanned the newspaper while she stirred her coffee without tasting it. Words were scarce, and when spoken, they carried the weight of command or defiance rather than intimacy. One evening, after returning from a business dinner, he found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour. She had baked bread from scratch, a habit she had learned from her mother in the tiny kitchen of their old home. The scent filled the room with warmth, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of his world. "You should have asked the staff," he said, setting down his briefcase. His voice was even, but his eyes lingered on the loaf cooling on the counter. She wiped her hands on a towel, meeting his gaze. "I did not want staff. I wanted to do something real." The answer unsettled him. He had not eaten homemade bread in years, not since his grandmother passed. He sat at the table, watching as she sliced it, steam rising from the soft center. Without asking, she placed a piece in front of him. He hesitated, then took a bite. The taste hit him like a memory he had buried deep, one that carried the echo of laughter long gone. For a moment, the mask of the distant millionaire cracked, but just as quickly, he straightened in his chair. "Do not mistake kindness for permission. Our contract has boundaries." Her lips pressed together, but she did not look away. "I know. I just wanted to remind myself, I am human, not a signature on paper." The words hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. He left the kitchen without finishing the bread, though the half-eaten slice remained, a silent witness to a moment neither of them wanted to admit had mattered. Days later, another public event arrived, this time a family gathering at his parents' estate. Cameras lined the entrance as they walked in, hand in hand. He leaned close, whispering instructions. Smile when my mother speaks to you. Do not answer my uncle's questions about money. Remember, appearances are everything. She nodded, her heartbeat quickening as the doors opened. Inside, chandeliers glittered, and whispers followed them across the marble floor. She felt every eye on her, weighing, judging. His grip on her hand tightened, guiding her through the gauntlet of scrutiny. At dinner, his mother lifted her glass and announced, "To my son and his beautiful wife, who have given us renewed pride in our family." The room applauded politely, but she caught the skeptical glances, the quiet calculations behind the smiles. Later, as they slipped away to the car, she exhaled shakily. "They do not believe in us. They think I am here for your money." His jaw clenched. "Let them think what they want. Our image is intact. That is what matters." She turned to face him in the dim light of the limousine. "Does it matter to you that I am more than just an image?" For the first time, his eyes flickered with something other than control, something almost vulnerable. He did not answer. Instead, he looked out the window as the city lights blurred past, the distance between them growing sharper even as their hands remained intertwined for the watching world. And so the façade continued. In public, perfection. In private, a war of silence. Yet beneath that cold arrangement, tiny cracks had begun to form, cracks that neither contract nor performance could forever contain. The days that followed seemed colder than the winter air outside the penthouse windows. They moved around each other like strangers trapped in the same cage, polite when necessary, silent when not. But fate had a way of pushing two people together when they least expected it. It began with a fever. She had been running herself ragged, balancing charity appearances, family visits to the hospital, and the constant weight of playing a role in front of the world. One night, she returned to the penthouse, pale and trembling. She tried to hide it, retreating to her room. But by midnight, her body shook with chills, and her forehead burned. He found her collapsed beside the bed, clutching a blanket. For the first time since their contract began, the mask slipped from his face. He knelt, touched her wrist, and felt the heat coursing through her. Without hesitation, he lifted her in his arms. "You should have said something," he murmured, carrying her down the hall. Her voice was faint. "I did not want to bother you. You made it clear. I am just a contract." His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He laid her gently on the sofa, fetched medicine, and pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. For hours, he stayed by her side, changing the compress, coaxing her to drink water, refusing to leave, even when his phone buzzed with business calls. In the dim light, she stirred and whispered, "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because despite everything, I am not made of stone." Her eyes fluttered shut, comforted by the rare softness in his voice. By morning, her fever broke. She woke to find him slumped in a chair beside her, his tie loosened, his head tilted as if he had fought sleep all night. The sight startled her more than his usual sternness. For once, he looked human, even vulnerable. Carefully, she reached for the blanket and draped it over his shoulders. He stirred, opening his eyes, and caught her in the act. Their gazes locked, and for a moment the silence between them carried something new, an unspoken understanding neither dared to voice. Later that day, as she prepared tea in the kitchen, he entered quietly. "Do not overexert yourself. You are still recovering." She smiled faintly. "That almost sounded like you cared." He did not reply. Instead, he poured himself a cup and sat across from her, their silence different, now less hostile, more fragile. That evening, the rain returned, tapping softly against the tall windows. She curled up on the sofa with a sketchbook she had kept hidden, drawing faint outlines of her brother's smile, her mother's hands, the small house they had lost. He walked in unexpectedly and paused. "You draw?" Startled, she shut the book halfway, but he reached out, stopping her. "May I see?" Reluctantly, she handed it over. He flipped through the pages, his eyes softening at the sketches filled with warmth and memories. "These are beautiful." Her breath caught. It was the first genuine compliment he had given her. "It is nothing," she whispered. "No," he said firmly, closing the sketchbook and placing it back in her hands. "It is everything. It shows who you are." The moment lingered, delicate as glass. Neither moved, as if afraid to shatter it. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the penthouse, something shifted. The walls of indifference had begun to crack, letting in a fragile light. And though neither admitted it aloud, both knew that something had changed forever. The fragile peace that had begun to grow between them did not last long. Just as their walls had started to soften, the outside world pressed in with cruel force. It began with whispers in the press. Tabloids published photographs of her at the hospital visiting her younger brother, twisting the story into headlines that accused her of exploiting her new status. "The contract bride's secret family debt," one newspaper screamed. Reporters camped outside the hospital, shouting questions that cut like knives. Was she using the millionaire's fortune to cover her family's poverty? Was this entire marriage nothing more than a scheme? She stood frozen on the hospital steps one afternoon, clutching her brother's hand, cameras flashing like lightning. Her chest tightened as the crowd pushed forward. Then, a black car pulled up sharply to the curb. The door opened, and he stepped out, immaculate in a dark suit, his presence commanding silence. He walked straight to her, ignoring the questions hurled in his direction. Without hesitation, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders and faced the cameras. His voice carried the authority of a man used to controlling entire boardrooms. "This is my wife," he declared. "Every rumor you have heard is a lie. She has nothing to prove to any of you. If you want answers, you can come to me, but you will leave her alone." The reporters fell back, stunned by his sudden defense. He ushered her and her brother into the car, slamming the door behind them. Inside, the silence was heavy. She stared at him, her throat tight. "You did not have to do that." His gaze remained forward. "Yes, I did. You are under my name now. They will not touch you." For a moment, she saw something fierce in his eyes. Not control, not coldness, but protection. It shook her more than his indifference ever had. Back at the penthouse, the tension continued. That night at dinner, his father's voice thundered across the table. "Do you see what you have done? The family name is being dragged through the mud because of this girl." She sat stiffly, unable to defend herself. But before she could speak, he stood. "Enough," he said sharply. "If anyone questions her, they question me, and I will not allow that." The room fell silent. Even his father did not reply. Later, when they were alone, she whispered, "Why are you fighting for me now? You told me I was only a contract." He turned to her, his jaw tight, but his eyes betrayed something he had not yet said aloud. "Maybe I was wrong." Her heart pounded at the words, but she did not press further. It was too fragile, too new. Still, as she lay awake that night, she realized something had shifted again. The world outside still doubted her, painted her as a fraud, a gold digger, a desperate girl clawing at wealth. But inside these walls, for the first time, she felt the weight of someone standing beside her. The war between appearances and truth was far from over. Yet in the flicker of his defense, she saw a man who might one day become more than a husband by contract. And that possibility was enough to keep her fighting against the storm of voices waiting outside their door. The days after his public defense of her felt different, as if an invisible barrier had cracked. She noticed it first in the little things. At breakfast, he no longer buried himself completely behind the newspaper. His eyes would lift occasionally, watching her stir her coffee, lingering as if he were searching for words he could not quite say. One evening, she returned from the hospital later than usual. Her younger brother had endured a difficult treatment, and her face carried the exhaustion of worry. When she walked into the penthouse, she found him waiting in the living room. His tie was loosened, his jacket draped over the sofa. "You are late," he said, but his tone was not sharp. She set her bag down, sighing. "The doctors needed me. My brother was in pain." For the first time, his voice softened. "How is he?" The simple question startled her. She blinked, almost forgetting how to answer. He is stable. Thank you for asking." He nodded once, but his expression betrayed something deeper. For years, he had kept his distance from vulnerability, but now, listening to her, he felt the walls he had built begin to weaken. Another shift came a few days later. They attended a charity gala, walking side by side under the glow of chandeliers. Cameras flashed as usual. But when she stumbled slightly on her heel, his hand steadied her instantly. The touch lingered longer than it should have. Firm, and reassuring. "You should be careful," he murmured. She looked up at him, their eyes meeting under the crowd's gaze. "You did not let me fall." For a moment, the mask of performance slipped. His lips curved, just barely, into the hint of a smile. That night, back at the penthouse, she caught him standing alone by the window, staring out at the glittering city below. He seemed lost in thought, his shoulders heavy with burdens she could not see. Quietly, she approached. "You carry too much," she said gently. "You pretend to be unbreakable, but no one island." He turned to her, startled by her honesty. "You think you know me?" "I know loneliness when I see it," she replied softly. The words pierced deeper than he expected. He looked at her differently then, not as the girl he had married for convenience, not as a contract signed in desperation, but as someone who saw through the armor he had worn for years. That night, neither of them spoke further, but something unspoken passed between them like a fragile promise. In the days that followed, he began to notice more of her quiet strength, the way she comforted her brother without complaint, the way she treated the staff with kindness, thanking them sincerely where others ignored them, the way she laughed softly at small things, carrying light into rooms that had long been filled only with shadows. And she, in turn, began to see his humanity peeking through the cracks. The long nights he spent buried in files, not out of greed, but out of responsibility for an empire he had never asked to inherit. The rare moments when he looked at her sketches, as if clinging to a world of color he had lost long ago. Each of them carried wounds. Each of them fought battles the other had not known. And slowly, cautiously, they began to realize that the war between them was giving way to something unexpected. It was not love, not yet, but it was no longer indifference. And in that fragile space between, hope began to take root. The night of their official wedding celebration arrived, a grand event planned by his family to showcase their perfect union. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, crystal glasses clinking as powerful men and women congratulated them. To the world, it was a fairy tale. To her, it felt like standing on a stage, the script written by someone else. When the final toast ended and the crowd dispersed, they returned to the penthouse. For the first time in weeks, there were no cameras, no flashing lights, no audience to play for. Only the silence of the high-rise apartment, the city lights glowing beyond the glass walls. She slipped off her heels and walked to her room, exhausted. But before she could close the door, his voice called out, "Stay." She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned back to face him. He stood there without the mask he usually wore, his expression raw, almost uncertain. "We have been living like strangers," he said quietly. "But tonight I cannot pretend anymore." Her breath caught. "What are you saying?" He stepped closer, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know why you agreed to this marriage. I know about your brother, about the debts, about the promises you made to your family. And I was wrong to think you were here for money. You were here because you had no choice but to sacrifice yourself." Tears stung her eyes. She had carried that burden silently, believing he would never understand. "How did you find out?" she whispered. "I listened," he admitted. "I watched, and I finally saw the truth." The distance between them closed. His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You are more than a contract, more than an arrangement. You are the only real thing I have had in years." Her chest tightened, torn between fear and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. "This was never supposed to be real," she said, her voice shaking. "And yet," he replied softly, "here we are." The room seemed to hold its breath. For the first time since their signatures bound them, their hearts spoke louder than the contract. The night that had begun as another performance had transformed into a revelation neither of them could deny. The truth was out, the walls were down, and in that moment, everything changed. The days after their wedding night felt lighter, almost fragile, as if a new beginning had quietly taken root. For the first time, she saw him, not as the cold, untouchable millionaire, but as a man willing to open his heart. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe in something beyond duty and contracts. But the world outside was not ready to let them be. It started with a betrayal. A rival within his company leaked stories to the press, claiming she had manipulated him into marriage to secure wealth and influence. Old photographs surfaced of her working late shifts in a diner, her apron stained with coffee, her smile tired but genuine. The media twisted them into a narrative of a scheming woman who had clawed her way into luxury. The headlines grew crueler by the hour. From waitress to wife, the greatest scam of the decade. Reporters hounded her outside the hospital, flashing microphones in her face. Her brother, still recovering, was frightened by the constant intrusion. She wanted to disappear, to run, to hide. One evening, she returned to the penthouse with tear-stained cheeks, clutching her sketchbook as if it were a shield. He was already there, pacing the living room, fury radiating from him. "They are tearing you apart," she whispered. "And it is my fault. If you had never signed that contract." He cut her off sharply. "Do not ever say that again. This is not your fault. They are vultures, feeding on lies." Her voice broke. "But your family, your business, everything you have built, they will not survive this scandal." His eyes hardened, but not at her. "Then let them burn. I will not sacrifice you to protect an empire built on appearances." The words stunned her. He had once lived by appearances, priding himself on control. Now, he stood in front of her, willing to risk it all. The next day, he proved it. At a press conference crowded with cameras and skeptical reporters, he walked to the podium with her at his side. The room buzzed with whispers, the air thick with judgment. He raised his hand, silencing them. "There have been rumors," he began, his voice steady, carrying through the hall. "Stories that paint my wife as a fraud, a woman who tricked her way into this marriage. I am here to tell you the truth." "Oh," he glanced at her, his gaze unwavering. "Yes, our marriage began as a contract. That is true. But what you do not know is why. She sacrificed herself to save her family, to protect her brother's life, and she has endured cruelty with grace and dignity. She is not a fraud. She is the bravest person I know." Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "If you wish to attack someone, attack me. I agreed to this contract. I hid behind it. But I will no longer hide the truth. This woman is not bound to me by ink on paper. She is bound to me by something stronger, by choice, by courage, by love. And I will stand against anyone who dares to question her worth." The hall erupted with noise, but he did not falter. He reached for her hand, holding it high for the world to see. In that moment, the narrative shifted. Some still doubted, some still whispered, but many saw what could no longer be denied. Their union was no longer a scandal, but a declaration. When they left the conference together, she whispered, her voice trembling, "You risked everything." He turned to her, his eyes burning with certainty. "You are everything. Without you, there is nothing worth protecting." Tears filled her eyes as she realized the truth. The crisis that threatened to destroy them had instead revealed the depth of his devotion. And for the first time, she no longer felt like a contract bride. She felt like a woman truly chosen, truly loved. The storm of scandal eventually quieted, though the echoes lingered. What once had been whispered as a fraud became a story of sacrifice and resilience. Some critics still sneered, but many began to see her not as a gold digger, but as a woman who had stood with dignity through humiliation. And more importantly, she no longer stood alone. One evening, weeks after the press conference, they returned to the penthouse together. The city stretched out beneath them, glowing with 1,000 lights. He led her to the balcony, where the cool night air carried the faint hum of traffic far below. In his hand, he carried the original contract, the document that had chained them from the beginning. He held it up between them. "This was supposed to define us," he said softly. "It was supposed to be our limit, our boundary. But it is nothing now." Before she could reply, he tore the pages in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the night like thunder. He let the pieces scatter into the wind, carried away by the city air. Then he turned to her, his eyes steady, his voice unwavering. "You are not my wife by contract. You are my wife by choice, by truth, and by love, and I want the world to know it." Her eyes filled with tears. For so long, she had carried shame, believing she was nothing more than a desperate girl trapped in a bargain. Now, standing before him, she felt free. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring he had once given her coldly, as a symbol of transaction. This time, He slipped it onto her hand with trembling fingers, his voice breaking with sincerity. Not as a condition, not as an obligation, but as a promise. Will you stay with me? Not because of a contract, but because you want to? Her voice shook as she whispered, yes, 1,000 times, yes. The city lights seemed to blaze brighter as he kissed her. Not for the cameras, not for appearances, but for the truth they had finally embraced. And so, the story that began with desperation and a contract ended with justice and love. They had torn down the walls built by wealth, prejudice, and fear. What remained was not a performance, not an arrangement, but something real. The millionaire had found his match. The contract bride had found her freedom. And together, they had found love.